Good morning, second grade. Miss Vandiver's with you today. I wanted to finish the last chapters of the Boxcar Children this morning, and I hope you enjoy the story. Let's get started. Ginseng. What Dr. McAllister ever did before Henry began to work for him would be hard to guess. There were certainly as many duties always waiting for him as he had time to do, and it made no difference to the industrious boy what the job was. Nothing was too hard or too dirty for him to attempt. One day the doctor set him at the task of clearing out his little laboratory. The boy washed bottles, pasted labels, and cleaned instruments for one whole morning, and more than one broken flask on its way to the rubbish heap was carefully carried up the hill to the Hinton family. While Henry was busy lettering a sticky label, he noticed a young man in the outer office who was talking with the doctor. "Can you tell me if this is real ginseng?" Henry heard him say. "It certainly is," returned Dr. McAllister. "They will give you $2 a pound for the root at any of the drug stores." Henry ventured to steal a peep, and found he could readily see the plant the man was holding. It was about a foot high, with branching leaves and a fine, feathery white flower. Henry knew it was exactly the same white puffball that he had noticed in Violet's vase that very morning. When the young man had gone, Henry said, "I know where I can find a whole lot of that plant." "Is that so?" replied the doctor kindly. "It's only the root, you know, that's valuable, but anyone who wants the bother of digging it up can sell any quantity of it." When Henry went home at noon, he related enough of this incident to set his sisters to work in good earnest. They started out with both knives and two strong iron spoons, and the kettle, and with Benny to run about finding every white flower he could. The girls succeeded, with a great deal of hard digging, in finding enormous quantities of ginseng root. In fact, that first afternoon's work resulted in a kettleful, not counting a single leaf or stem. Henry was delighted when he saw the result of their work, and took it next day to the largest drugstore, where he received $3 for the roots. Without any hesitation, Henry paid a visit to the dry goods store, and came home with a pair of new brown stockings for Benny. That was a great day in the woods. Benny gave them no peace at all until they admired his wonderful new stockings and felt of each rib. There had been one other thing that Benny had given them no peace about. On the night when the children had crept so quietly away from the baker's wife, Jess had forgotten to take Benny's bear. This bear was a poor-looking creature, which had once been an expensive, bright-eyed teddy bear made of brown plush. But Benny had taken it to bed every single night for 3 years, and had loved it by day, so that it was not attractive to anyone but himself. Both eyes were gone, and its body was very limp. But Benny had certainly suffered a great deal trying to sleep in a strange bed without his beloved bear. Jess, therefore, had plans on foot. The moment she saw Benny's new stockings, she washed the old brown stockings with their many neat darns and hung them up to dry. And early in the afternoon, she and Violet sat with the work bag between them, each with a stocking. With Benny sitting by to watch proceedings, Jess mapped out a remarkable teddy bear. One stocking, carefully trimmed, made the head and body, while the other furnished material for 2 arms, 2 legs, and stuffing. Jess worked hard over the head, pushing the padding well into the blunt nose. Violet embroidered 2 beautiful eyes in black and white, and a jet-black nose tip. "You must make a tail too, Jessie," said Benny, watching her snip the brown rags. "Bears don't have tails, Benny," argued Jess, although she wasn't exactly sure she was right. Her old bear didn't have any tail, you know. "But this bear has a tail, though," returned Benny, knowing that Jess would put on 2 tails if he insisted. And it was true. His bear finally did have a tail. "What kind of tail?" asked Jess helplessly at last. "Bushy, long, and slim, or a cotton tail?" "Long and slim," decided Benny with great satisfaction, "so I can pull it." "Benny!" cried Jess, laughing in spite of herself. But she made a tail, long and slim, exactly as Benny ordered, and sewed it on very tightly so that it might be pulled if desired. She fastened on the legs and arms with flat hinges so the bear might sit down easily, and added at last a pair of cunning flappy ears and a beautiful collar of braided red string from a bundle. "What's his name, Jessie?" inquired Benny, when the wonderful bear was finally handed over to him. "His name?" repeated Jess. "Well, he's a new bear. He isn't your old one, so I wouldn't call him Teddy." "Oh, no," said Benny, shocked. "This is not Teddy. This has a pretty tail." "Of course," agreed Jess, trying not to laugh. "But we sold the ginseng to pay for your new stockings, and if you hadn't had your new ones, you couldn't have made this bear out of your old ones." "You want his name to be Stockings?" asked Benny politely. "Stockings? No," answered Jess. "I was thinking of Ginseng." "Ginseng?" echoed Benny, thinking deeply. "That's a nice name. All right, I think Ginseng would be a good bear, if Watchy doesn't bark at him." And from that moment the bear's name was Ginseng, as long as he lived, and he lived to be a very old bear indeed. Trouble. The days went merrily by for the freight car family. Hardly a day passed, however, without some exciting adventure. Mrs. McAllister, finding out in some way that Violet was a clever seamstress, sent home fine linen handkerchiefs for her to hem. Each one had a tiny colored rose in the corner, and Violet was delighted with the dainty work. She sat sewing daily by the swimming pool, while Benny sailed wonderful boats of chips and waded round to his heart's content. The freight car pantry now held marvelous dishes rescued from the dump, such rarities as a regular bread knife, a blue and gold soap dish, and half of a real cut glass bowl. Henry proudly deposited $31 in the savings bank under the name of Henry James, and worked eagerly for his kind friend, who never asked him any more embarrassing questions. Benny actually learned to read fairly well. The girls occupied their time making balsam pillows for the 4 beds, and trying to devise wonderful meals out of very little material. Violet kept a different bouquet daily in the little vase. She had a perfect genius for arranging 3 purple irises to look like a picture, or a single wood lily with its leaves like a Japanese print. Each day the children enjoyed a cooked dinner, filling in the chinks with perfect satisfaction with bread and butter, or bread and milk, or bread and cheese. They named their little house Home for Tramps, and printed this title in fancy lettering inside the car. One day Jess began to teach Benny a little arithmetic. He learned very readily that 2 and 1 make 3. "I knew that before," he said cheerfully, but it was a different matter when Jess proposed to him that 2 minus 1 left 1. "No, it does not left 1," said Benny indignantly. "It left 2. "Why, Benny," cried Jess in astonishment, "supposing you had 2 apples and I took away 1, wouldn't you have 1 left?" "You never would," objected Benny with confidence. "No, but supposing Watch took 1," suggested Jess. "Watchy wouldn't take 1 neither," said Benny. "Would you, doggie?" Watch opened one eye and wagged his tail. Jess looked at Violet in despair. "What shall I do with him?" she asked. Violet took out her chalk and printed clearly on the outside of the freight car the following example: 2 minus 1 equal. "Now, Benny, don't you see," she began, "that if you have 2 things and somebody takes away 1, that you must have 1 left?" "I'll show you myself," agreed Benny, finally with resignation. "Now see the 2?" He actually made a respectable figure 2 on the freight car. "Now, here's a nice 1. Now, s'posen I take away the 1, don't you see the 2's left right on the car?" He covered the figure 1 with his chubby hand and looked about at his audience expectantly. Jess rolled over against a tree trunk and laughed till she nearly cried. Violet laughed until she really did cry. And here we come to the first unpleasant incident in the story of the runaway children. Violet could not stop crying, apparently, and Jess soon made up her mind that she was really ill. She helped her carefully into the car and heaped all the pine needles around and under her, making her the softest bed she could. Then she wet claws in the cool water of the brook and laid them across her little sister's hot forehead. "How glad I am that it is time for Henry to come," she said to herself, holding Violet's slender brown hands in her cool ones. Henry came promptly at the usual time. He thought she had a cold, he said, and this seemed likely, for Violet began to cough gently while the rest ate a hasty supper. "We don't want to let her go to a hospital if we can possibly help it," said Henry, more troubled than he cared to show. "If she goes there, we'll have to give her name, and then grandfather will find us surely." Jess agreed, and together the two older children kept changing the cool cloths on Violet's aching head. But about 10 o'clock that night Violet had a chill. She shivered and shook, and her teeth chattered so that Jess could plainly hear them. Apparently nothing could warm the little girl, although she was completely packed in hay and pine needles. "I'm going down to Dr. McAllister's," said Henry quietly. "I'm afraid Violet is very ill." Nobody ever knew how fast he ran down the hill. Even in his famous race, Henry hardly touched his present speed. He was so thoroughly frightened that he never stopped to notice how quickly the doctor seemed to understand what was wanted. He did not even notice that he did not have to tell the doctor which way to drive his car in order to reach the hill. When the car reached the road at the base of the hill, Dr. McAllister said shortly, "Stay here in the car," and disappeared up the hill alone. When the doctor returned, he was carrying Violet in his arms. Jess and Benny and Watch were following closely. Nobody spoke during the drive to the McAllister house, as they flew through the darkness. When they stopped at last, the doctor said 3 words to his mother, who opened the door anxiously. The 3 words were, "Pneumonia, I'm afraid." They all heard it. Irish Mary appeared from the kitchen with hot water bottles and warm blankets, and Mrs. McAllister flew around opening beds and bringing pillows. A trained nurse in a white dress appeared like magic from nowhere in particular. They all worked as best they could to get the sick child warmed up. Soon the hot blankets, hot water, and steaming drinks began to take effect, and the shivering stopped. Mrs. McAllister left the sick room then to attend the other children. Henry and Benny were left in a large spare room with a double bed. Jess was put in a little dressing room just out of Mrs. McAllister's own room. Upon receiving assurances that Violet was warm again, they went to sleep. But Violet was not out of danger. She soon grew as hot as she had been cold, and the doctor never left her side until 10 o'clock the next morning. Violet, although very ill, did not have pneumonia. At about 9 o'clock, the doctor had a visitor. It was a man who said he would wait. He did wait in the cool front parlor for over half an hour. Then Benny drifted in. "Where is the doctor?" asked the man sharply of Benny. "He's upstairs," answered Benny readily. "This means a lot of money to him if he only knew it," said the visitor impatiently. "Oh, that wouldn't make any difference," Benny replied with great assurance as he started to go out again. The man caught him. "What do you mean by that, Sonny?" he asked curiously. "What's he doing?" "He's taking care of my sister Violet. She's sick." "And you mean he wouldn't leave her even if I gave him a lot of money?" "Yep, that's it," said Benny politely. "That's what I mean." The visitor seemed to restrain his impatience with a great effort. "You see, I've lost a little boy somewhere," he said. "The doctor knows where he is, I think. He would be about as old as you are." "Well, if you don't find him, you can have me, I shouldn't wonder," observed Benny comfortingly. "I like you." "You do?" said the man in surprise. "That's because you've got such a nice soft suit on," explained Benny, stroking the man's knee gently. The gentleman laughed heartily. "No, I guess it's because you have such a nice soft laugh," said Benny, changing his mind. The fact was that Benny himself did not know why he liked this stranger, who was so gruff at times and so pleasant at others. He finally accepted the man's invitation and climbed into his lap to see his dog's picture in his watch, feeling of the nice soft suit on the way. The doctor found him there when he came down at 10 o'clock. "Better go and find Watch, Benny," suggested the doctor. "Perhaps some day I'll come again," observed Benny to his new friend. "I like your dog, and I'm sorry he's dead." With that he scampered off to find Watch, who was very much alive. "I expected you, Mr. Portis," said the doctor, smiling. "Only not quite so soon." I came the moment I heard your name hinted at, said James Cordis. My chauffeur heard 2 workmen say that you knew where my 4 grandchildren were. That's all I waited to hear. Is it true? And where are they? Well, that was one of them, said the doctor quietly. That was one of them? Repeated the man. That beautiful little boy? Yes, he is beautiful, assented Dr. McAllister. They all are. The only trouble is, they're all frightened to death to think of your finding them. How do you know that? Said Mr. Cordis sharply. They've changed their name. At least the older boy did. In public, too. What did he change it to? Dr. McAllister watched his visitor's face closely while he pronounced the name clearly. Henry James. A flood of recollections passed over the man's face. He flushed deeply. That boy? He exclaimed. That wonderful running boy? Then events began to move along rapidly. Caught. They never will go with you in this world, declared Mrs. McAllister, finally to the distracted grandfather, unless you give us time to break the news gradually, and above all, when Violet is so ill. Couldn't I see them? Begged the man, almost like a boy. I could pretend I was a friend of yours, visiting you, who liked children. I would promise not to tell them until you consented. That might do, said Dr. McAllister. If they grew to like you before they knew who you were, it would make things easier, certainly. So Henry James Cordis's chauffeur was sent for a gold monogrammed suitcase and his young man to wait upon him, and Irish Mary held up her hands in despair when she learned for whom she must cook. Don't you worry, Mary Bridget Flynn, said Dr. McAllister with emphasis. You could cook for the King of England. Just make one of your peach shortcakes for lunch and broil a chicken, and I'll answer for him. When lunchtime came, J. H. Cordis saw all his grandchildren except Violet. He smiled with delight when he saw Jess coming down the stairs in her womanly fashion. Henry shook hands with him before he sat down, but he kept glancing at the stranger all through the meal. Where have I seen that man before? He thought. Mrs. McAllister had given the children's names clearly when she introduced them. Jess, Benny, and Henry. Henry James, she had added, but she had not added the man's name. She forgot, thought Jess, because she knows him so well. She thinks we do. But although nameless, the stranger caught their attention. He told them wonderful stories about a steel rail which held up an entire bridge until the people had time to get off, about his collie dog, about a cucumber in his garden growing inside of a glass bottle. Henry was interested. Benny was fascinated. I'd like to see the cucumber, said Benny, pausing in the middle of his shortcake. Would you indeed? Said Mr. Cordis, delighted. Some day, if Mrs. McAllister is willing, you and I will ride over to my garden and pick it. And we'll bring it to Violet? Asked Benny, waiting breathlessly for an answer. We'll bring it to Violet, agreed Mr. Cordis, resuming his shortcake. After lunch, he went to sleep in the easy chair in the doctor's big office. That is, he threw his head back and shut his eyes and breathed very heavily. Jess went through the room once with ice water, humming, for Violet was better. But the moment she saw the stranger asleep, she stopped her singing abruptly and tiptoed the rest of the way. Then, as suddenly, she turned around and came back, and very carefully shoved a cushion under the man's feet. It was so gently done that even if he had really been asleep, he would never have wakened. As it was, he could not resist opening one eye the slightest crack to see the bright chestnut hair as it passed out of sight. No, he thought to himself, if she really hated me, she would never have done that. The children were very far from hating him. They liked him immensely, and when at last, one day, he was allowed to see Violet come softly into her room, the nosegay of fragrant English double violets for her, they loved him. He won all their hearts when he patted her dark head and told her very simply that he was sorry she had been sick. It would have been hard to say that J. H. Cordis ever had a favorite grandchild, but certainly his manner with Violet was very gentle. It was clear to everyone, even to the anxious nurse, that the stranger was not tiring the sick child. He told her in a pleasant, everyday voice about his garden and his greenhouses where the violets came from, about the old Swede gardener who always said he must water the violets. "I'd love to see him," said Violet earnestly. "How long are you going to stay here?" Benny piped up. It was not altogether a polite question, but it was clear to them all that Benny wanted him to stay, so they all laughed. "As long as they let me, my boy," answered the stranger quietly. Then he left the sick room, for he knew he should not stay long. But something in the man's last sentence rang in Henry's ear. He repeated it over and over in his mind, trying to remember where he had heard that same voice say, "My boy." He made an excuse to work in the flower beds along the veranda, in order to glance occasionally at the man's face as he sat reading under a tree. Often Henry thought he had caught hold of his truant memory. Then the man turned his head, and he lost it again altogether. Suddenly it came to him, as the man smiled over his book. It was the man who had shaken hands with him on the day of the race, and he had said, "I like your spirit, my boy." That was it. Henry sat down out of sight and weeded geraniums for a few moments. It is a wonder he did not pull up geraniums instead of weeds. His mind was so far away. "I didn't remember him at first, because I was so jolly excited when he shook hands with me," decided Henry. Then he was apparently thunderstruck afresh. He sat with his weeder on his knee, and his mouth open. "He's the man who passed me the cup with the wings." He stole another look around the corner, and this satisfied him. "Same man exactly," he said. When he had finished the flower bed, he thought he heard the young doctor moving in the office. He stuck his head in the open door. The doctor sat at his desk, taking notes from a book. "Do you know who presented the prizes field day?" asked Henry curiously. "Know what his name was?" "James Cordis, of the steel mills," replied the doctor carelessly. "J. H. Cordis, over in Greenfield." Dr. McAllister, to all appearances, returned to his notes. His eyes were lowered at any rate. But for Henry the skies were reeling. He withdrew his head and sat still on the step. That delightful man was his grandfather? It was impossible. He was too young to begin with. Henry expected a white-haired gentleman with a cane and a terrible voice. But all the time he knew in his soul that it was not only possible, but really true. He recalled the man's reply to Benny's direct question. He said he was going to stay as long as they would let him. Could it be that the man knew them without introducing himself? A perfect torrent of thoughts assailed Henry as he sat crouched on the office steps. It was clear to him now that Mrs. McAllister had failed to mention his name on purpose. It was a wonder Benny hadn't asked what it was long before this. He noticed that the man was getting out of his chair under the trees. "It's now or never," thought Henry. "I've got to know." He walked eagerly after the man, who was going toward the garden with his back turned. Henry easily caught up with him, breathing with difficulty. The man turned around. "Are you James Henry Cordis of Greenfield?" panted Henry. "I am, my boy," returned the man with a long lip. "Does that question of yours mean that you know, that I know, that you are Henry James Cordis?" "Yes," said Henry simply. The man's eyes filled with tears, and J. H. Cordis of the steel mills shook hands for the third time with his grandson, H. J. Cordis, of the Home for Tramps. And that's where we're going to leave it today. I'll be recording the last 3 chapters and posting those very, very soon. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you guys soon. Much love from Ms. B.